Next up, we have Mr. Jim Stein for the Government Industry Data Exchange Program, or GIDEP.
All right, so good afternoon. I'm Jim Stein, the GIDEP Program Manager. I'm going to be staying on the title slide for a few moments, so don't worry, we're not experiencing any technical difficulties. The world economy is an extremely complex system with myriad supply chains crisscrossing the globe. The glue that binds all this together are the specifications and standards. They define the technical expectations for entire technically complex enterprises, for example, multimodal container shipping or robotic assembly lines, or the many systems employed by the U.S. Department of Defense. A naval aviator, an engineer, once told me, a modern jet aircraft is 5 million parts flying in close formation. If any one of those fails to meet the expectations, problems can occur. The technical expectations defined by specs and standards continue all the way down to the piece parts that are the building blocks for these enterprises. Generally, industry seeks to meet or exceed the objectives set out in the specs of standards. But what happens when an error occurs, or even worse, a company chooses to cut corners? Those errors could result in items that do not meet the standard. An item that does not conform to a standard, specification, or advertised performance characteristic is referred to as non-conforming. If you discover non-conforming item, you make a risk-based decision and take actions you deem appropriate. When the defect is not patently obvious and required an effort to uncover through inspection and test, your first instinct is to guard the information as your property. If your discovery relates to common items, maybe others in the industrial base and supply chain who have not discovered that problem yet could benefit from your knowledge. Today, I'm going to give you a quick overview of GIDEP, a look at what to expect from the result of our GIDEP Information Technology Technical Refresh, which we've been doing for a couple of years, and an update on counterfeit mitigation, focusing on the government regulations and non-government standards. GIDEP's mission is to foster technical information sharing among government and industry. By sharing, we can improve safety, reliability, and readiness while lowering ownership costs across the system lifecycle. GIDEP is a web-accessible database providing a way for the industrial bases and supply chains to share information that could benefit the whole community. So, a rhetorical question. If knowledge is power, how can an organization give it up without giving up any competitive advantage? Well, first, you are sharing fact-based technical information about common items. Second, the information is predominantly regarding what I will call piece parts, for example, gears or microcircuits or fasteners. And third, and most importantly, if all GIDEP members share information, then each member benefits from the information all others share, so you're gaining a lot more than you give. The risks that non-conforming parts represent can appear when parts are being selected during design, when parts are integrated during production, or when they are changed out during repair and maintenance during the sustainment part of the life cycle. While this mission of GIDEP has evolved over the 6 decades that GIDEP has existed, it is heavily influenced by the willingness of its members to share the information that they possess that would otherwise remain unknown. This information can be described as unknown knowns. You know something, but until you share it, everyone else is in the dark. There are a number of major catastrophes that have occurred around the world where if that one person had shared the knowledge they had, others would have avoided the catastrophe. GIDEP serves as a sharing platform for the U.S. and Canadian defense supply chains, as well as the U.S. federal government at large. This permits sharing within the government, within industry, and between government and industry. Most recently, there has been interest in figuring out how GIDEP can support the federal government's Critical Infrastructure Protection Program. I've already described non-conforming parts, and in case you're not aware, counterfeit parts are considered to be non-conforming. If you cannot get replacement parts to perform a repair, a DMSMS situation results, and there are a number of impacts. You'll hear more about this in Ms. Brown's presentation next. On the topic of feature changes, as an example, if you find out a replacement part is the recommended form-fit function replacement and your system is at the high-tech end of the spectrum, you should look closely at what features have changed in the part to avoid problems. For example, as electronic parts get smaller, the features within them also get smaller. They become more susceptible to electromagnetic discharge and something called tin whiskers, so buyer beware. And finally, GIDEP is a way to get government-approved calibration procedures for the systems that DoD uses, and these help organizations that are doing maintenance procedures. GIDEP's currently undergoing a technical refresh. It has been almost 2 decades since we had a significant update to the GIDEP system. When we complete this technical refresh, we should be able to see an improved functionality for users trying to register, as well as overall membership management. So users and companies who have teams of GIDEP users can manage those people more efficiently. The process for reporting to GIDEP will also change and become easier, allowing organizations to populate the report in sort of a real-time fashion before submitting into the GIDEP database. We'll have improvements in searching the database. Rather than simply searching for titles or a few keywords, we'll be able to search virtually all the text within the database to find what you need to see. You'll be able to look at trends across reports. So rather than submitting a query in the database and getting a list of 25 reports, you'll be able to drill down into the reports and find out what the common threads are across them. And as in most modern information technology systems, the screen you're looking at with the GIDEP data can be arranged in the way that you want to see it. We hope to have this system fielded during this next year, and we'll be offering a lot of training to make people comfortable with this. The training, of course, is probably only for people over 30 years old. Anyone under 30 will be able to look at it and intuitively figure out how to make it work. Apologies to everyone over 30. On the topic of counterfeit mitigation, avoidance, and detection. Counterfeit avoidance came onto the DoD radar in about 2008 when a study by the Department of Commerce noted a very large increase in counterfeits entering the Department of Defense supply chain, magnitudes of increase over a period of 3 years. As a result, DoD now has a number of regulations, policies, and best practices, and all of these fall into the quality assurance section of the federal regulation, section 46. Here, 252.246-7007, it describes the counterfeit electronic part detection and avoidance system that our contractors should be using. It was published in August of 2016. This system covers 12 features that a counterfeit detection and avoidance system should possess, and this parallels the 12 system features required by Congress in the National Defense Authorization Act 2012, Section 818. For example, the system addresses elements such as the training of employees throughout the quality enterprise, the inspection and testing protocols that should be considered, risk-based management, what to do when you suspect counterfeit part is identified, and how to keep informed of other trends. Note that this includes reporting to GIDEP and screening information in GIDEP, which are highlighted in red on the slide. One of the best ways to avoid counterfeits is to deal with reputable suppliers. This regulation -7008, Sources of Electronic Parts, was published in May 2018 and is aimed at the Department of Defense's supply chain. It covers parts destined for DoD and addresses what the government expects when a system integrator selects a supplier. Essentially, the regulation specifies two supplier categories that you should be able to trust: the original component manufacturer and those authorized by the manufacturer to distribute the parts. These transactions can be made with minimal counterfeit detection and inspection and test, but it always depends on the use of the part. If parts are not available from these sources, you can also use a contractor-approved supplier with additional provisions, including government approval of that supplier. And finally, if you can't find a part from any of the above sources, you're required to inspect, test, and prove the authenticity of the part to the government's satisfaction. Reporting nonconformances to GIDEP, published in November of 2019. This regulation is almost 30 years in the making. It was originally envisioned after the fraudulent fastener investigation of the late 1980s. By the time government was starting to put meat on the bones of this concept, DoD's acquisition reform put a hold on any new regulations. It was again a topic of discussion after the federal fraudulent aluminum heat treating investigation in 2001, but it didn't make it. The stars finally aligned after counterfeit electronic parts began infiltrating the DoD supply chain. The investigation discovered, and there were actually several investigations, discovered that various organizations across government and industry were finding counterfeits, but not sharing what they have discovered with the rest of the community. So the Congress decided that should change, and this regulation was developed. It applies to all the federal agencies of the U.S. government and was co-sponsored by NASA and the General Services Administration, GSA. This regulation is required in contracts that invoke higher level quality assurance provisions, which essentially are what you would need if you have a very complex system that must be inspected during its assembly and build, or where an item is considered critical. The DoD has many items in weapon systems that are considered critical to the functionality of that system, or if they include electronics destined for DoD, which is where the whole problem began for DoD. The regulation requires that organizations that discover common items that exhibit a major or critical nonconformance, those are nonconformances that mean that the part will not function as required, or items suspected of being counterfeit, must be reported to GIDEP within 60 days. The regulation also requires the contractor to screen reports that are in GIDEP to see if any match parts that they are integrating into their assemblies. There is also a parallel DoD instruction that has been drafted requiring DoD organizations to report to GIDEP, and it should be completed by the end of the year. So with the DoD instruction and the acquisition regulation, a large sector of the defense industrial base has a requirement now to report and screen the information in GIDEP to avoid non-conforming and counterfeit parts. Non-government standards. Discussion of the many non-government standards dealing with counterfeit detection and avoidance would normally require many hours to cover. So today I will simply present some observations. Many standard development organizations are working on standards intended to stem the flow of counterfeit parts. Some SDOs have developed simple, common sense approaches, while others have a full suite of standards that dissect the supply chain rules and lay out very specific expectations. For example, there are standards for the original equipment manufacturer, sometimes referred to as a prime manufacturer, the distributors, the original component manufacturers, system integrators, test labs, and certification houses. As mentioned in the panel session earlier, there are government personnel heavily involved in all of these standard development teams, and many of them are regarded as very sharp in the area that they are discussing. Since we have a global economy, the standards must appeal to organizations across the globe. There will be language, cultural, and legal barriers to development and acceptance of these standards. Initially, counterfeits were simply a way for someone to profit. More recent cases suggest that efforts are being made to introduce counterfeits with malicious intent to compromise our systems. The difference of what is expected when testing and avoiding counterfeits depends on how critical the part is to the system it is in, how risks can be mitigated, and to a large degree, the cost to implement. Where an item is used, for example, if you're manufacturing a Teddy Ruxpin talking doll, talking teddy bear, you may not care if the microcircuit that runs it is a counterfeit. Of course, with the advent of the Internet of Everything, that is just the place to put a maliciously modified circuit. There have been reports of smart devices having malicious code inside that listen in and report back to the criminals or nation-state actors. As mentioned earlier, you can mitigate the risk of counterfeits by either scrutinizing the parts themselves or by only purchasing from suppliers that you trust. Since DoD has many systems designed across many decades, the DoD approach is a blend of these methods. While great strides have been made in the area of microelectronics, having been the first supply group to be targeted by counterfeiters, there is still much to be done with other commodity areas. There are around 78 federal supply groups and 645 federal supply classes. For example, things like chemicals, fasteners, wire rope, pumps, motors, bearing, refrigerant, stock metal, pipes, and tubing, and the list goes on. The ones I cited are just some of the ones where counterfeits have been discovered. Finally, criminal activity. So this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, in that the recommended tests that are prescribed in the standards are openly discussed in the standards and in conferences. Counterfeiters are able to find out what techniques we use to uncover their crimes. So naturally, the counterfeiters modify their techniques to make it harder for us to find the counterfeits. This is going to be a problem into the future as we share ways to find counterfeits. And it is going to be a problem that we have to resolve, because we're giving away our secrets by being good citizens and sharing the knowledge that we have. That being said, these non-government standards still represent the best way to consistently avoid counterfeit intrusion to our supply systems. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you.